Chapter 451 Wandering Mind. In the present world, the southern seas. It didn't take much time for Volos and Eros to cross the great distances. They traveled through the deep spirit realm, and within a few flashes, they shifted from the spirit realm to a position above the Sea Emperor's palace. The fragrant sea, the nearly non-existent guards, the faintly visible luxurious divine palace. That was all there was to it. Clearly, the Sea Emperor didn't believe anyone could silently approach him through the sea. Of course, he wasn't actually wrong about that. Just like now, even the black and white ocean, reflected by the first layer of the spirit realm, looked different near Poseidon's domain, even containing some colors within it. Like Olympus, the places where deities dwell year-round naturally bear the influence of their powers. This influence over the years seeped into another temporal dimension, instinctively keeping away the life of the spirit realm and making it very difficult for others to directly infiltrate the side of the Sea Emperor. If it were the little god of love from the original myths, faced with such a situation, he might have been helpless. He couldn't hit a deity residing in his own palace. After all, his golden arrow may have had unique power, but he himself was not an unparalleled archer. However, facing the same problem, Volos and Eros were not worried. While Uranus' divine blood gave their bow and arrow the restraint of revenge, it also endowed it with the ability to lock on to a target. Coupled with the Gungnir, inherited from the divine lance, everything became much simpler. Thump, drawing the bow and positioning the arrow with the sound of the bowstring vibrating, the golden arrow in Volos' hand shot forth. Even though the pair had not yet seen anyone, it still followed a certain connection, flying directly towards the palace beneath the sea surface, chasing after the master of the place. Inside the divine palace, wine flowed and laughter filled the air. At this moment, inside Poseidon's palace, the true Sea Empress Amphitrite had long left for places unknown. Most of those who remained were the attendants Poseidon had found from various places. Some had been sought out, while others outright carried the blood of Poseidon. This wasn't unusual among the chaotic gods. The reason Amphitrite wasn't here had nothing to do with these matters. After all, although she did not like Poseidon's behavior, she lacked Hera's power and status. If the Sea Emperor wanted to indulge in pleasure, then she could only choose to endure it. It wasn't until she realized that more and more peculiar life forms that made her uncomfortable were appearing in the divine palace that Amphitrite finally awoke to the truth and then moved to another place to live. She thought she understood why Poseidon had lost interest in her. It wasn't because of the chase she had deliberately created before their marriage, but because his tastes were inherently different. Of course, strictly speaking, there was also a bit of that factor involved. Poseidon certainly felt annoyed by Amphitrite's once unperceptive behavior, but there was also a bit of too many exotic beauties to attend to, neglecting this woman. It is worth mentioning here that Poseidon could certainly discern beauty and would consider Athena and Aphrodite to possess top-tier attractiveness. It's just that the scope of his recognition was a bit wider. Those exotics he selected, if judged according to their own racial standards, were also quite beautiful. This was somewhat similar to the legends of the dragon race in later times, where a stunningly beautiful princess was to be seized, as was a beauty from the dog-headed folk. Thus, in his own palace, Poseidon was enjoying the dance and song before him until a streak of golden light flashed before his eyes. Swish! Suddenly startled, Poseidon's immense divine power was unleashed, instantly causing nearly all the creatures in the palace to die or be injured. Yet, he was unfazed by this and swiftly reached out, trying to catch the gleam of gold. An ambush, without a doubt. However, the power it carried was not strong. Although Poseidon did not know who dared to interrupt his pleasure, he swore to himself that he would make them understand the consequences of disrupting him in his domain. Poof! In the blink of an eye, as the thought flashed through his mind, the golden light had already arrived. Unexpectedly, he was unable to block the beam of light. The golden arrow pierced through, or, rather, ignored the divine power on his hand, directly contacting his palm and disappearing in an instant. There was no time for any reaction. Once everything was over, Poseidon looked at his own palm. There was no wound. The golden light seemed like an illusion. What is this? Surprise and confusion arose in his heart. Just as Poseidon was about to do something, he suddenly stopped. For some reason, a fiery emotion surged from his heart, an affection toward his older sister Demeter. After a long silence, and perhaps a brief struggle, Poseidon ultimately gave in to the sensation in his heart. He looked around his palace, and the lives farther away that were not affected by his power. Demeter was his true love. What did these others matter? So, without hesitation, the Sea Emperor pressed his hand down, and within 100 miles, a stillness settled instantly. After doing this, Poseidon calmed down a little bit. His reason told him that his current state was abnormal, and it must have something to do with the streak of golden light. But the gods of chaos mostly act on emotion over reason. Thus, this brief moment of clarity was fleeting, and almost without further thought, he decided to consider the matter later. Chapter 452. Now, finding his sister was the most important thing. Transformed into a beam of light, Poseidon flew towards the north. He had also heard of the harsh winter stirred up by Demeter, and now it seemed she was in a human tribe. Behind a cloud over the ocean. All right, work's done. Next, we just wait at that goddess's place. Clapping his hands, Volos said contentedly. His golden arrow would keep going forward until it hit its target. Although there were beings in this world that could stop it, at least Poseidon probably didn't have that ability. And now, the feeling that came to him was indeed so. Without any surprises, his arrow had hit the target. Good. Speaking of which, that goddess seems to be in a temple built for her in that human kingdom. Nodding lightly, Eros said with a bit of longing, I wonder when we can find some believers to play with, and then have them build a temple for us too. Better not. Rejecting the idea offhand, Volos gave an irrefutable reason. I think humans are quite foolish. It's better to stay away from them. We are gods who control desire, not gods controlled by desire, but, from what I see, humans seem quite easily controlled by their own emotions, especially those among them who hold the highest status. Okay, you're right. Let's not have any believers then. After a moment of thought, Eros felt persuaded and agreed that she indeed should stay away from them. Their idle chat ended, and she prepared to leave with Volos. However, at this moment, a loud noise came from the ocean surface below. A blue light split the sea, turning all nearby life to dust in an instant. Immediately after, Poseidon's figure leaped out from the ocean and flew towards the north. It worked, but are arrows fueled by mortal hatred really that powerful? Volos was somewhat surprised and puzzled as he felt the surge of emotions in the Sea Emperor's heart, that possessiveness for his sister Demeter, but it seemed a bit too intense. That's probably because he has always had such thoughts. EW. Stay away from me too. Looking at Volos beside her, Eros made a face of disgust. Her 11 or 12-year-old appearance combined with her current expression made for a somewhat adorably contradictory sight. Cut it out, Eros. As split gods of desire, the last thing that could happen is us developing feelings for each other. Volos smirked, knowing the other was joking, so he didn't take it seriously but just called out, Let's go, follow him. With a call, Volos took the lead, and after a laugh, Eros also followed suit. The great drama was unfolding right before them, and they didn't want to miss such a scene. The spirit realm, the fifth layer. In the chaotic spacetime, as always quiet, only now there was an addition that looked like a mere point of light on the outside but seemed infinitely vast on the inside. A phantasmal kingdom. Sitting cross-legged in the void, above Lane's head and below his feet were the increasingly stable interfaces of positive and negative energy. A certain connection between them was becoming more and more intimate, which gradually brought balance to the two energy planes, which had initially been unbalanced. However, at this moment, Lane's mind was not on them, but on the movements of the outside world. Of course, Lane wasn't paying attention to that small human kingdom either. Although he did take note of everything that happened there because of the Twins of Desire, he didn't have any surplus thoughts about the whole event. Whether it was Metaneira or Demeter, their actions were not worth much attention. After all, the first half of the event's development was extremely similar to later myths, and the unfolding of the latter half seemed quite normal. Compared to the future deeds of a king named Tantalus, a son of Zeus, the affair between the goddess and the queen was truly trivial, and he had no intention of intervening. He would not even have remembered such a minor matter if it hadn't involved the changing of the seasons. As for what Lane was doing now, that was naturally waiting to observe an important memory. Hundreds of years ago, after that divine battle had ended, Lane had handed over his divine artifact to Athena, allowing her to peer into past memories. During this period, the goddess of wisdom had used it more than once, trying to understand the whereabouts of her mother goddess, who had once resided in Zeus' head alongside herself. However, it might have been that that period indeed had some higher-order influence, or perhaps it was the subtle interference of fate, or both. Every time Athena tried to explore that brief but significant past from her dim pre-birth memories, she would always encounter some invisible disturbance, and then her focus would shift to other matters. Most of what she found was emptiness, but there were a few instances with content, mostly when Zeus made use of Métis' wisdom and authority. Every time this happened, the divine king had no choice but to relax the seal on the goddess. It might not have been enough to free Métis from his imprisonment, but it did allow a tiny bit of the outside world to seep through, unheard by Athena in her unconscious state. These things would not have come back to her normally, but now, with the influence of the divine artifact, Athena remembered them one by one. Of course, although these were also gains, which let the goddess understand a side of her father god not known to others, Athena ultimately remembered what she was truly searching for. Some higher power was always interfering with her, which seemed difficult, but these were her own memories, real and existing. So when she found that clever methods couldn't do the job, Athena resolutely chose the foolish way. If she couldn't pinpoint that period, then she would just extract all the memories before her birth one by one. This simplest and most brute force method, also the most time-consuming and strenuous one, was not affected by that underlying influence. Thus, over the past several centuries, Athena spent most of her time dwelling on her past. Although much of it was cumbersome and futile, luckily, recently this exploration of memory finally reached its end. When all the useless parts were isolated, what remained could no longer conceal its existence. So on a small island in the East Sea, Athena in a long gown took out a scroll. For the last time, she activated the divine artifact, pressing it against her smooth forehead, and with this act, both history and memory acted upon the goddess. The secret was about to be unveiled, a tinge of emotion-induced flush flitting across Athena's face. It was also at this moment that Lane's gaze shifted away from the twins and towards the goddess on the island. He too was exceedingly expectant about the results of this inquiry. "Come on, let me see what exactly you did." The voice echoed in the void, Lane's gaze flickering slightly. The next moment, as if something had changed, his body remained seated in place, but his divine essence seemed to have left his body. The last exploration was different from the previous ones, as Lane chose not to merely watch, using the power of the divine artifact to browse through memory fragments. He knew well that this memory might involve a clash at the world level, so it was influenced by extremely high powers. If he waited for the divine artifact to present the records on its own, the crucial parts would probably all be blurred. And as for asking Athena afterwards, putting aside other issues, even if she was willing to tell Lane the whole story without omission, some mysteries can only be grasped and understood by seeing with one's own eyes. Like the rune symbols, what was recorded in the primordial codex was completely different from what was later spread. Over the years, Lane had not been short on consulting the codex from Odin's treasury, and he learned many useful things each time. The closer the information is to its source, the more true and complete it is. Thus Lane had to see for himself. If there's anything in the chaos world that might have even a slight resistance to the powers at the world level, it could only be Lane himself. So when he conceived this thought, the divine body he left behind became an empty shell. Lane's spirit departed his body silently and joined Athena above the East Sea, entering the deep recesses of her memory. Intuition told Lane, This journey into memory would perhaps be quite interesting. And what he was about to see would probably be not just the experiences of Zeus ascension rituals. Chapter 453. The False World. A sweep of darkness. It felt as if plunged into the cold emptiness of the void, thoughts frozen, surrounded by an icy touch. Only in the depths of the spirit, some extraordinary power radiated warmth, driving away that coldness. Bizarre visions flashed by in an instant, returning to nothingness, but the sensation of cold grew ever stronger. Lane was well aware that this was likely the residual influence of the world. The power from the 9 realms had been erased both in the past and the future, so the only force truly affecting this memory was that belonging to chaos. It instinctively prevented the probing of other lives, but wouldn't actively react in other obvious ways. So while its presence made Lane feel conceptually cold, it went no further than that. Thus, the journey continued, and with it, the concept of time blurred. It felt like a day, or perhaps a second, when at a certain moment, Lane seemed to catch a glimpse of a strand of color. Whoosh! The flow of space-time, the leap of ages, as if breaking through a membrane, entering a world of illusion. When Lane regained consciousness once more, he found, to his astonishment, that he was not as he had imagined, upon Mount Olympus or inside Asgard in the Chaos world. These two places were where Zeus was most likely to have obtained that peculiar ritual, and even Lane was prepared to see Odin here, but at this moment, his surroundings were unfamiliar, and he stood upon a slightly damaged city wall. A great battle seemed to have just ended, with an air of solemnity lingering all around. Not far off, many mortals moved about. Some bore wounds and moaned in pain, while others donned armor and kept vigilant, patrolling the area. Nearer, hundreds appeared slaves. They carried heavy stones, seemingly engaged in the reconstruction of the damaged wall. And that was just nearby. Further afield, both within and without the city walls, crowds of people gathered, each under different banners. And Lane's current location was right at a breach in the wall. "Who are you? Raise your hands!" A sharp cry shattered the silence. Instantly, Lane's presence drew the gaze of everyone nearby. Clearly, no matter how he had appeared here, the sudden emergence of a stranger amid post-war tension sparked an immediate nerve. 24 soldiers raised their weapons, their eyes tense and filled with intent to kill, as if ready for conflict at the slightest provocation. From a distance, sensing Teach's disturbance, even more soldiers were approaching. As for the one who had just shouted, he looked to be the captain of this troop of soldiers. He was calling out to Lane, but as the initial surprise faded, although Lane heard the soldier's warnings, he obviously had no intention of complying. Instead, he scrutinized his environment with greater depth, gazed up at the sky and down at the earth, and finally sensed his own power. The law of this world was strikingly similar to the present world, some force trying to bind him, and an impression of reality that seemed true yet somehow hollow. However, Lane was certain that this hollow reality would not have been detected by any other primordial deity. For, although this world seemed somewhat artificial, the essence of the force constituting this artifice was sufficiently high. Numbers were sparse, sure, but at higher levels, quantity was useless compared to quality. The Flesh Mother tree, with just a few higher traits, rendered Erebus utterly powerless against it. And although Lane was not clear about the details of this event, his understanding of truly creation-level powers was evidently more profound. As for this almost non-existent force, one needed not think too hard to know it was likely that remnant world force on the memory. To this plane of existence, information, matter, and energy made no difference. Even if only a memory in one's mind, its power was as real as any. At least I can be certain that Zeus's transformation and ritual are indeed related to the world itself. The force wrapping around the memory does not come because Zeus is the destined divine king, but because the content in this memory involves the world itself. As for the current situation, this is not some parallel universe. The chaos world does not entertain such notions. Nor is it some traversal through past and future. Such ludicrous events would not occur to me. If the future were truly reachable, then this world would already be dead. indicating that it has lost all its unknowns and potentials, and with it, its reason to exist. This feeling is a bit like a possibility of fate, momentarily realized under the creation-level power, though it still can't disguise its falsehood. And this world, let's just call it a world for now, seemed to attempt to restrict my power the moment I entered, though it was pointless. Lastly, from the current structure of the world, this place is chaos, but without any trace of the spirit realm's existence. In almost an instant, Lane made the above judgments. This should not be any sort of time travel or dimensional crossing. He well remembered his purpose for this journey. He was here to search for the memory of Zeus's secret. So, no matter what changes occurred, this place should still be that memory. Chapter 454. The False World _2. However, from the current situation, it seems that this ephemeral memory has experienced a small accident. Under the influence of the power of the world, perhaps also affected by some subjective will, it has changed. It is no longer a mere existence for people to observe, but has transformed into a cage for outsiders. Yes, a cage. If one excludes his own subtle yet real higher nature, Lane could almost be certain that even he would be trapped in this memory, struggling to escape for a considerable length of time. And this is likely the very purpose of this fantasy world's existence. Is it Zeus? Doesn't quite seem like it, but can't completely rule out the possibility. However, no matter what, this is indeed quite a surprise. Shaking his head slightly, it must be said, this was the second time Lane had found himself surprised by Zeus and his ritual. But this isn't too strange after all, since Zeus himself may not be considered very strong. But as long as he remains the recognized divine king of the present world, it's normal for some things to happen. Of course, in the end, the reason why Lane is indifferent is because whoever is responsible, their plans have obviously fallen through. If this is a cage, then since he is in fact not restrained, he already holds the absolute initiative in this unexpected game. Moreover, Lane is curious to know, since that meager world force constitutes this false interface, if he were to destroy this world, where would that force go? It certainly wouldn't return to the world itself. After all, as mentioned before, since it exists as information within this memory, it should naturally change along with the ownership of the memory. If chaos had consciousness, it wouldn't be so simple. But as with every past occurrence, it has no logic or thought. Attack! Take down this foreigner! A fierce shout suddenly erupted, pulling Lane's thoughts back to reality. Perhaps having confirmed that they do not recognize this outsider, the soldiers of the city have already begun to advance with swords drawn. Their captain charged at Lane first, determination and intent to kill in his eyes, while the rest sought to encircle from either side. As soldiers, their tactics were indeed proper. However, these were clearly methods meant only to deal with fellow mortals. Even those whose divine blood had diluted over time could crush this small squad of mere dozens with absolute power. Of course, these soldiers were more intent on buying time since this was, after all, their city. However, as their target, Lane had no intention of playing along with them, so, halt! As his words fell, an invisible wave spread out, and in the next moment, the surrounding soldiers became rigid on the spot. As if time had been stilled, they could not move even a fraction of their bodies. In their midst, there was only one exception, and that was the leading captain. However, it wasn't that he had the power to resist Lane, but that he was the only one spared. Tell me, soldier, where is this place? His voice was calm as Lane asked indifferently, demonstrating an irresistible power and then inquiring for the information he desired should yield a swift response. But before Lane, the soldier was not afraid. Evil outsider, do you think you can make me submit? No matter which deity you are, you have no right to intervene in this battle. Even feigning ignorance is futile. Your actions are under the gaze of the gods. You will surely be punished, an inescapable outcome, for such is the will of the great Zeus. Is that so? After a moment of silence, Lane nodded in recognition of the soldier's conviction, then reached out and gently touched his brow. The next moment, the soul of the soldier was extracted. Mortals aren't like deities. They can't truly protect their secrets before Lane. His choice to ask was merely a habit. But when he dropped this habit, a memory, neither clearly true nor false, soon emerged in his mind. I see. Having learned the truth, Lane scrutinized the unfamiliar surroundings once more and finally understood the source of his initial familiarity. The walls beneath his feet contained sacred power, capable of repelling and weakening the destruction wrought by demigods and deities, a creation beyond the work of mortals. And outside the city, uncountable tents and armies gathered. There, divine power manifested itself within the camps, with similar auras also rising within the city, the owners of these auras possessing extraordinary strength, able to defeat deities that had come to the mortal realm to some extent. As for the city, it was famously known in later ages. It represented the end of Chaos's mythology, the end of the era of gods and demigods, one side of the 10-year war, the legendary city of Troy. Only now the war might have just begun. Because, as the soldier had just said, Zeus had just resolved on Mount Olympus to forbid the gods from meddling in the conflicts of the mortal realm. From this, one could infer that the true climax of the war has yet to come. Chapter 455. The False World _3. What a pity. This isn't real. With a sigh, Lane felt a tinge of regret. If this were the real world, he would have indeed liked to stay a bit longer, to witness firsthand this epic that was supposed to unfold in the future. Even Heracles, who had passed through the 12 labors, existed at this time. But reality held no ifs. A fabrication would remain so, unrealizable no matter what. Lane had not forgotten that he had merely entered into a segment of memory, and even though it had been influenced by the creation force, a memory or a piece of fate was not enough to evolve into a true world. Everything happening here was probably without any referential value in the present world. Moreover, this fabricated world evolved from the memory seemed to represent the original fate, to be more precise, a world without the existence of Lane. Since that's the case, go tell your gods. Go pray to the great Zeus. Tell him, someone has defied his command, and will soon witness his divine power on Mount Olympus. With a gentle wave of his hand, the soldiers who were previously immobilized collapsed to the ground one after another. Without giving them another glance, Lane turned around and spoke with a calm voice. I will, and the King of all gods will see everything you've done. And then, as he promised, he will send down your punishment. Raising their heads proudly, some people shouted back. Like many in this era, not everyone understood the reverence due to an unknown deity. Everyone from kings to commoners acted this way, and Lane had no intention of fussing over it further. After all, when this illusory world vanished, everything would also crumble into oblivion. Now, before setting out to destroy this world, there were two issues that truly piqued his curiosity. One was whether this fake world had replicated the existence of primordial deities. Although the probability was low, he still wanted to take a closer look. The other question was how Athena, who had entered with him, was faring now. Unlike him, this false world seemed to have replicated the fate without Lane, which placed him directly at the most critical place in that fate, above the walls of Troy. But Athena was different. In this world's Mount Olympus, there already existed a Athena. No hurry. First to the underworld, to see if the realm of eternal night and lightless exists. Regardless of the outcome, then I'll take action to destroy it. Then to Olympus to see what Zeus is really up to, if indeed this has anything to do with him. Having made his decision, Lane cast one last look at this mortal city. At this moment, his previous regret had gradually faded away. With his presence, all was destined not to play out this way. In the real world, this history would be even more grandiose. It won't be long. Far off, there seemed to be someone approaching quickly, but Lane had no intention of waiting. What was the point of witnessing falsehoods? Better to wait for reality, to then see the real performance of the heroes of these times. Early morning, Mount Olympus. Time and space shifted, reality and illusion interchanged, as if passing through prolonged periods. Like Lane, Athena too felt no cold sensation from the world's forces and, at a certain moment when everything came to an end, she finally regained consciousness, slowly opening her eyes. Then the next moment, to her astonishment, she found herself inside the palace of the divine court, surrounded by deities she recognized and some she did not. They differed somewhat from the gods in her memory, but overall she could still identify them. At this moment they were standing to both sides, gathered around Zeus. Initially, Athena even thought she had been caught prying into memories, but then she felt something was off. Around her, no one gazed her way. They were all looking up at Zeus, the highest among them. Even the herself from this world was doing the same. This king of all gods was somewhat different from the one in Athena's memory. He was stronger, more casual, and indisputably authoritative. At this moment, Zeus was unabashedly exuding his presence, as if lecturing to the deities, and every deity present had no choice but to listen intently. Listen, all gods and goddesses. I announce my decree here. From this day forth, should I discover any deity daring to defy my command, going to the battlefields of the mortal realm to aid the armies of those city-states, then upon their return to Olympus, my thunder will bring them to utter humiliation. Or perhaps, I will pick them up and hurl them into the depths of Tartarus, as far as the underworld is from the sky and the earth. Thus, maybe then you will understand, no one dares defy my command. Surveying the deities, the divine king declared loudly, "Come now, gods of Olympus. I know you're displeased with this. Among those warring humans, there are those you favor, but such is my will. If you wish to challenge my authority, feel free to give it a try. Let me lower a golden rope from the sky. You all stand at the other end of the rope. Even if you exhaust all your strength, you cannot shake the Supreme King. And with just a slight effort, I can lift you all up, including the earth and the endless ocean." Chapter 456. All. Atop Mount Olympus, standing amidst the gods, Athena quietly listened to the edicts of Zeus. The sudden change of environment, the different aura of the deities around her. Everything was somewhat beyond the goddess of wisdom's expectations. She had merely been probing her own memories, yet she didn't expect such events to occur. Especially as the words of Zeus came to an end, Athena noticed that the gaze of the gods seemingly swept over her. Or more accurately, not just her but also Hera and Aphrodite, only more so directed at her. Realizing this shift, Athena seemed to understand something. Everything was clearly related to what Zeus had previously stated. His references to the battlegrounds of the mortal realm, the armies of city-states, must be deeply connected to her and the other two deities, to the extent that all the gods were awaiting their reaction. As for why more gazes were turned toward her, the goddess of wisdom faintly felt that it might be because at this moment, she had become the second only to the divine king on Mount Olympus. It wasn't that the gods had become weaker, but rather, she now seemed stronger. At least compared to before, this familiar yet strange body of hers housed a power far greater, almost at the pinnacle of the gods. Thinking swiftly in her heart, Athena suppressed the inexplicable thoughts and reeled in her dispersed focus. Regardless, no matter how powerful she was now, the divine king before her was only stronger. In response to the edict of Zeus, passivity was not advisable, nor was direct confrontation appropriate. Therefore, based on the information she could grasp at present, the goddess made a simple judgment of the situation. She decided to grant herself more leeway and, for now, deal with the matters at hand. Hence, after a brief silence, the goddess slightly lifted her head, and under the attentive or neglectful gazes of the gods, Athena broke the silence atop Mount Olympus. "Son of Cronus, sovereign of gods, master of the sky and earth, your power is undeniable. How could any god entertain the thought of challenging you? Nevertheless, I still grieve for the loss and suffering of those beings of wisdom. They are destined to face a tragic fate, their blood to flow in rivers beneath high walls and across the wilderness. And all this could have been avoided." There was a tinge of sorrow in her tone, and as Athena's compassionate words were spoken, the atmosphere in the hall seemed to ease slightly. At the intersection of the gods' gazes, Zeus too revealed a smile. Above the Mount of the Gods, the clouds that had gathered due to the will of the Lord of the Thousand Thunders slowly dissipated, symbolizing the change in their master's mood. Gazing at the most radiant among the gods, the divine king spoke with a smile. Do not be disheartened, Tritogenia, another name for Athena, my most cherished daughter. The affairs of the mortal realm will achieve their deserved outcome. My words are not meant as a harsh reprimand. I always bear goodwill towards you. No one dared to contradict him, and it was only natural, for everyone knew the power of the divine king, and thus Zeus relaxed his stern expression. Ever since Poseidon had stirred up a laughable rebellion, the divine king often employed this method to remind these eternal deities. Now that his will had been carried out once again, the impromptu assembly could come to an end. Now, it was time for him to descend to the mortal realm to steer the human war towards the outcome he desired. Indeed, Zeus had forbidden the gods, but not himself. He had his own personal reasons for issuing such a decree. However, just as the divine king was about to summon his chariot, a streak of light crossing the distant horizon suddenly caught his attention. Hermes, what brings you here? Surprised, the divine king paused his steps. His gaze turned beyond the Mount of the Gods, and swiftly, that figure rapidly entered the perception of the deities. Standing aside, Athena silently observed this scene. Another god she had not seen before. Hermes, the goddess silently noted the name. After a while, as the streak of light descended to the ground, a youthful deity with the appearance of a young man appeared before the gods. A hint of irreverent amusement played at the corners of his mouth, making him seem like a cunning and clever individual. His gaze flicked over the gods and settled on the divine king, and then he made a slight gesture to his chest. Respectful king of all gods, my formidable father, just as you commanded. I have honored your decree and conveyed the gods' non-interventionist oracle to the mortal realm. There was a slight pause in his tone as he discreetly observed the expressions of the gods before continuing. But as I was preparing to return, your majesty, an unexpected situation arose in the city of Troy in the mortal realm. A strange deity attacked the city guards and ignored your orders. Even in the end, according to the humans present, he declared that he would come to Olympus, to this dwelling place of the gods, to witness your unmatched power. In the original myths, the wind gods were not Zeus's confidants. In contrast, as a son of the divine king, ruling over travel, thievery, and eloquence, Hermes was the messenger of the gods. And prior to this, he was the one who had delivered Zeus's oracle to the humans. Now, he also brought back this unexpected news. Moreover, he didn't express any personal opinions as before. This time, Hermes stated the situation truthfully, without mixing in any other thoughts. Chapter 457 All. Openly defying the divine king was not without precedent. But those who had done so were either special deities like the heavenly empress or the sea emperor, or they had already suffered terrible punishments. Hermes did not intend to get involved in this, and when his voice fell, Olympus once again fell silent. In silence, the clouds once again gathered. The divine king was still smiling, but his smile now had a trace of coldness. An unfamiliar deity. Hermes, this is quite rare. Your Majesty, perhaps he was newly born, unaware of your power, similar to what the goddess of beauty once was. This is entirely understandable, he replied politely, while blinking in the direction of Aphrodite. The embodiment of love and beauty had intimate relationships with many of the gods of Mount Olympus, and Hermes was no exception. You are right, my child. I should always be extra tolerant of the offenses of the ignorant. The divine king nodded slightly, acknowledging this rationale. However, to confirm this, he looked again at his messenger. In front of Hermes, Lane's apparition had been conjured. This was an entity he had never seen before, perhaps indeed a newly born deity. Does anyone recognize him? Asked the divine king, to which the gods all shook their heads. Seeing this, Zeus narrowed his eyes and said with a smile, Since no one knows him, then perhaps it is as Hermes has said, so let's wait here for him. If he has come to witness my power, then I will grant him this opportunity. As the king of all gods, it is only proper to show such magnanimity. The longer one lives, the more often strange beings come to challenge him, and it was not uncommon for mortals and deities alike. Thus, after a brief surge of anger, Zeus instead relaxed his mood, seeing this as an amusement and an opportunity to demonstrate his power once again. Engrossed in his thoughts, Zeus did not notice the brief look of astonishment that flashed in Athena's eyes upon seeing the image of that unfamiliar god. The goddess recognized his presence. He was the one who had once entrusted her with a divine artifact. What truly surprised her, though, was not just this fact. For just now, the apparition that Hermes had projected seemed to nod at her. In the underworld, within the Narcissus Plains, walking on the gray land, Lane casually observed his surroundings. Previously, he had examined the vicinity in turn. Unlike the real underworld, this version in the Tapestry of Fate had neither the comings and goings of wraiths nor any trace of the primordial deities. Places like the Abyss and the Land of Eternal Night certainly existed, but they were merely that, existent. Yet, within them, Lane felt no semblance of consciousness. Just as he had thought before, this world had no trace of a second great divine power. Whether this was because the scant creation force was insufficient for this task, or simply because it was never done, was unknown. But this only made Lane surer, false is false. Even if it was Zeus of this counterfeit world, his power was likely mostly a matter of setting. After all, even though to the creation force all things are equivalent, the information carried within a fragment of memory is insufficient to transform into such vast energy. And these souls, they are nothing but copies, he muttered. His gaze swept across the surroundings. The underworld in this original version of Fate was much livelier than in reality. Perhaps because of the great wars in the mortal realm, the souls of the deceased had flocked to the underworld. Crowds of figures paid their silver coins, obelisks, and were ferried across, then walked some distance until they arrived at a grand palace to face the judgment of the three underworld judges. Unlike the spirit realm in reality, which judged a soul based on abilities and deeds during life, these three, who in life were renowned humans and then elevated upon death, rendered the fate of mortal souls on the simple scales of good and evil. Those lives interwoven with good and evil would stay here, in what was known as the Narcissus Plains, a place covered in fields of golden wheat. They fed on it, and as they wandered, their memories of life were gradually erased, along with any trace of their existence. The soul's evil, far outweighing good, would be sent near Tartarus to endure punishment. The gods had built a massive prison there to confine these sinners, and those with good far outweighing evil could continue on, enjoying an eternal and blissful life in the Elysian fields constructed by the gods until the last of their soul energy was consumed and they dissipated into the world. As for the judgment of good and evil in a person's life, it's quite an obvious matter. Those who are devout and faithful are undoubtedly the most good, while the opposite is considered the most evil. In other standards of judgment, there is also a strong tint of subjectivity. However, this is normal, for the judges and paradises established by the gods are naturally prepared for the devout. Deciding good and evil based on faith doesn't seem so strange after all. So for the people who originally existed in this world, after she enters, will she merge into one with her former self? Eyes flickering, Lane had already bypassed the judges and arrived within the fields of truth. However, at this moment it was the scene of Hermes on Mount Olympus morphing his image that appeared. Following this intangible connection, Lane directly saw everything happening there. In a myriad of falseness, suddenly having one truth was undoubtedly very conspicuous. What really intrigued Lane was whether this meant that Athena had also seen the future. Although it was just the future as it was originally, he watched as the goddess cleverly found an excuse to temporarily leave the company of the other gods and headed straight to her palace. And as one could almost envision, the first thing Athena would observe was the history under this particular trajectory of destiny. What had happened in the past, what role she played in it, why this world looked so similar to the original yet differed in myriad ways. Once she looked, such confusion would almost certainly emerge in Athena's heart, and then she would try to explore the reasons behind it. The thing is, it is already the third epoch now. Simply regard the original trajectory as something to be viewed. Withdrawing his attention, Lane refocused his thoughts on the underworld. Before him, a figure had appeared without him noticing. The master of the underworld had detected him, or rather, had been aware of him the moment he unguardedly set foot upon this land. Yet it wasn't until Lane reached this point that Hades felt he had no choice but to confront him. Even though he did not detect the aura of this unknown deity, Hades had been feeling an alarm in his heart. So, if possible, he truly did not wish to face Lane. "Strange deity, why have you come?" Speaking cautiously, Hades could not simply ignore the presence at his doorstep, regardless of everything. "I have come for destruction." With sincere tone, Lane replied, "Destruction? Has some mortal provoked you, and you wish to bestow upon him eternal punishment?" With eyebrows relaxing, Hades inquired. If that were the case, then it was not a matter of great concern. He had been wondering why this deity had come directly to the fields of truth. The Olympian gods had similar wants in the past but never informed him about them. They would simply take away or do something, never regarding him with any importance. If that were the case, then I agree. No, you misunderstand. Shaking his head slightly, Lane looked at Hades. I am referring to everything. Every soul? That's probably not such a good idea. With a tone carrying a trace of astonishment. This time, Hades couldn't help but sound dismissive. It was not that no god ever came here to claim the souls of some mortals, but to ask for all was a bit too extreme. Of course not every soul. With a smile, Lane slowly corrected. By everything, I mean this entire world. Chapter 458. The Path to Dismembering the Origin. Under the dim sky, the glow from the flowing river of molten lava brightened half of the sky. On the vast land below, the souls of mortals were faint and sporadic. This was a scene rarely seen in the reality of the underworld. As the ruler of the underworld, Hades had been particularly busy lately because the great war among mortals had brought the underlying conflicts among the Olympian gods to the surface, and the death toll of humans kept rising, resulting in a massive influx of souls into the underworld. However, watching the gods wage war upon the earth while remaining as an onlooker, Hades found some pleasure amidst the busyness. But now, his good mood had come to an end. Looking at the stranger before him, Hades's expression grew increasingly somber. Often, Hades did not care about how outsiders viewed him, so even though there were no temples dedicated to him on the surface, and mortals still widely believed that he trembled at the powers of other deities, he didn't react too strongly. Whether it was those prejudices or formalities, if they did not bring him any tangible benefits, Hades did not care much. In this regard, he was more pragmatic than his father. Cronus might still care about appearances, but to Hades, they were worthless. Therefore, Hades had no intention of provoking this strange deity, unless he had claimed to want to destroy the underworld. After all, as the god of the underworld, he was a part of the underworld itself, and its destruction would mean his own. Indeed, Hades did not take Lane's words to mean the whole world but thought he was referring to the underworld only. Though, just as a god cannot commit suicide, even Hades himself did not know how the underworld could be destroyed. Strange deity, I think it would be better for you to take back your words. The voice turned cold, seeming to realize the visitor's ill intent. Silently, the authority over half of the underworld began to converge upon Hades. With the power of the realm enhancing him, an intangible pressure enveloped the entire fields of truth. However, even so, the power Hades displayed at this moment was actually less than his real self in reality. Due to Lane's vague influences, even though he had been stripped of his authority over souls, the power of the underworld in reality had not diminished but increased compared to its original path. Although in myths mortal souls do exist within the underworld, they do not truly benefit the place. It was the Titan Iapetus who was originally the god of souls, and the title Lord of Shades was more often associated with Hecate. I don't know what you intend to do, sir, but destroying the underworld. I must be blunt, I doubt anyone is capable of doing such a thing. Without notice, several streaks of light rose from the divine palace of the underworld. The god of destruction, the god of doom, and a number of other deities stood behind Hades, all eyeing Lane warily. The underworld is a part of the world, and not even the king of all gods can destroy it. State your purpose, or stay here forever. The fields of truth may not be Olympus, but it will not tolerate your audacity. Power was latent but not displayed, with only a pressure sweeping over like a blanket. Yet, when it reached the deity before him, it seemed to press upon empty space, making Hades even more vigilant. Hades began to recall if there were any past grudges with this unknown deity, still not taking direct action, since he did not really believe what Lane had said before. Destroying the underworld was nothing short of fantastical. On the other side, Lane had to admit that if not for this being a fantastical world, Hades would indeed be correct. The underworld could weaken, could break, but could never be destroyed, unless the perpetrator already possessed the power to oppose the entire world, or unless the world itself was preoccupied elsewhere, as the world itself would not allow such a thing to happen. Much like anyone wishing to destroy one of the 7 layers of the spirit realm would actually need to have greater power than the entire spirit realm itself. But the current situation was undoubtedly of the latter kind. The faint forces of creation lingering in memory were not substantial. They barely sustained this world's existence and could not bring about any further influence. In such circumstances, what Lane needed to consider was merely how to truly destroy the underworld at its source. Just as I've been pondering, on some future day when the collision between chaos and the Heminu world reaches its zenith, how am I to truly obliterate the source of that world? Observing the illusory underworld as if nobody else was present, the reason Lane had not gone directly to Olympus was not merely to see if the primordial gods existed, as such would be a matter of mere steps for him. In truth, the real reason was that he too was unclear on how to destroy a world. Would mere destruction suffice? Probably not, and absorbing the world holistically from a macro perspective was beyond his current capabilities. Under such conditions, the self-contained realm of the underworld naturally became the most suitable target. He would use this place for the first experiment, then validate it using the entire illusory world, and the Heminu world would be when he applied the experimental outcome. Crackle. With a light sound, the black sword, formed by death, was drawn inch by inch from the void. In the absence of any divine artifact specialized in combat, this had become Lane's preferred method. Chapter 459, The Path to Dismembering the Origin _2. You're right, no one has ever managed to destroy the underworld before, and even in the real world, I can't do it yet, let alone talk about having any experience in it. The voice was calm, as if Lane was talking to himself rather than to these false gods. Hand on the hilt of his sword, he stood in the void with his sword as a prop, his gaze passing over Hades, beyond the entire fields of truth, looking towards the source of this illusory underworld. So although I know it probably won't work, I still want to try, to see how much impact disintegrating the underworld can have on this world. The next moment, his sword tip pressed down, and the final blade touched the underworld soil. In front of Lane, as soon as he drew the black sword, Hades had already made his move. Although his power was contained and did not leak, as the god of the underworld, Hades felt a terrifying threat from that sword. Even though he still didn't believe Lane could destroy the underworld, he couldn't tolerate the other party desecrating the symbol of his godhood. But it was meaningless. Although it seemed right in front of him, it was as distant as the sky. Until Lane pressed down the black sword as if no one were around, Hades couldn't make any meaningful resistance. So, under the shocked and furious gaze of the gods of the underworld, that seemingly ordinary black sword touched the soil of the underworld. Splash! At the entrance of the underworld, on the Acheron River, River of Sorrow, Charon sat in his wooden boat, once again heading towards the shore. Lately, because of wars in the mortal realm, his job had become much busier. After all, as the ferryman of the Styx River, only Charon could carry the souls of mortals across this endlessly rolling river. Of course, corresponding to the busyness, his earnings had also increased quite a bit. After all, according to the regulations, each person crossing the river must give Charon a silver coin as the fare for the passage. This is also the origin of a custom in the mortal realm. Even though they dread death so much that they are unwilling to mention the names of the gods of the underworld, mortals still place a silver coin in the mouth of the dead when they bury them. Otherwise, The souls of their loved ones could only wander at the entrance to the underworld or sink to the bottom of the Styx River, unrestful for eternity. Of course, no matter what, Charon is a god, and what he actually needs is not the silver coin itself. What he truly gains is the remembrance placed upon the silver coin by the deceased's family and their awe of him, the ferryman. Hey, I really hope the wars in the mortal realm last a bit longer. Days like these don't come along often. An old smile appeared on his wrinkled face as Charon picked up a goblet of nectar from the boat and took a satisfying sip. He looked towards the shore, where a dense crowd of souls was jostling there. It's just that there's one downside. The times of turmoil seem to have brought a lot of mortals whose bodies are left uncollected after death. He complained casually, but it was a happy trouble, so Charon quickly put it out of his mind. He summoned his power to make his wooden boat significantly faster, hurriedly making his way towards the shore. As he got closer, the eager and awe-filled eyes of the souls became clearer, brightening Charon's mood even more. He knew what these souls were thinking. Staying here meant only enduring the cold wind and hunger, while crossing the Styx River. Even if their actions in life weren't enough to allow them into the Elysian fields, they could at least stay on the Narcissus Plains. In this situation, naturally, they were all desperate to leave here first. But the right to choose who gets on the boat first is in my hands. With a sly smile, Charon stood up from the boat, ready to pick out a few pleasing ones. What are they looking at? Suddenly, Charon seemed to notice something different from usual. The souls on the shore were indeed looking in his direction, filled with awe but also with fear, and some were shouting loudly about something, or kneeling on the ground, trembling with dread. What new trick is this? Unaware of any anomalies, Charon was somewhat puzzled. This was the underworld after all. There might be things that made mortals fear, but certainly not the embodiment of the Styx River. So he leisurely shook his clothes, then turned around to check. I wonder. Whoosh! Darkness swept before his eyes before he could see anything. And before he could react, a flash of black light instantly erased Charon's divine body from this world. Behind him, the black light continued to spread at an inconceivable speed across the Styx River, diffusing far beyond. The souls of mortals were instantly extinguished. The sparse vegetation turned to dust. There was no sound, only disappearance. On the banks of the Acheron River, not a single whisper could be heard. All fell silent, and only the Styx River continued to flow. After a while, the water rippled slightly. Through the surface of the river, one could see a phantom shadow coalescing below the water. As the ferryman of the Styx River, Charon obviously hadn't died just now. But as he regained his senses from the recent shock, he was still somewhat bewildered. What just happened? Feeling lost, Charon didn't know what had happened, but the inexplicable force just now seemed to come from the direction of the fields of truth. So he looked through the river's surface towards the center of the underworld. Everything was as usual, as if the recent horror were but a dream. Except for the underworld being emptier, there was only that black spot high in the sky. Chapter 460. The Path to Dismembering the Origin _3. It seemed he had noticed something. Charon abruptly turned his gaze toward the distant sky. It wasn't just a black dot but a figure at the highest point. In a flicker, the figure appeared somewhat disappointed, shook his head, then, gripping a long sword, slashed downwards. Boom! An inexplicable sense of alarm surged in his heart, a feeling of fear conveyed by the Styx River itself to Charon. Instinctively wanting to flee, he found there was nowhere to hide. The next moment, as if it were a continuation of the previous changes, when the black sword pressed down, the entire realm shook with it. The water of the Styx River churned out of its banks, the molten magma of the fire river flowed through fissures in the ground, and then everything came to a halt with a sword slash that split the entire underworld from east to west, as if everything had utterly died. The River of Sorrow was no exception. This river, which caused all who approached to sink to the bottom and wail in despair, now also seemed to have lost its vitality. Even as the riverbanks cracked, its waters remained still. Charon's consciousness swirled and danced in the river. He felt no pain because he knew that he was about to become yet another deity to sleep eternally. No, in this instant, the Styx River ferryman, hovering between life and death, seemed to sense something. He wouldn't rest eternally, because of that sense of falsehood and emptiness pervading everything. The next moment, Charon's consciousness was completely extinguished. In this false world, he was the first deity of chaos to die, but he would not be the last, for high above, Lane once again raised the edge of his sword. Clang! Flicking the sword's blade, although it was a temporarily condensed black sword of authority, it now seemed to have taken on a physical form. Listening to the crisp and pleasant metallic tremor, Lane gazed down upon the underworld. This was the seventh sword strike. It had eradicated the creatures of the underworld, split the axis of its land, and calmed the three Styx rivers. Looking out now, the entirety of the underworld appeared as if stricken by an apocalyptic disaster. But this was only the perspective of mere mortals. If one looked beyond appearances and gazed directly at the origin of all things, Lane would be startled to find that what he had done was actually of very limited use. The world is physical, it is spiritual, and it is conceptual. In what he had just done, at best, he had damaged its physical structure, and even when reflected at the origin, the impact on the underworld was not as dramatic as imagined. It would be wounded, but it was just wounded. Stop! What on earth are you trying to do? A roar interrupted Lane's thoughts. Not far away, Hades with his severed arm watched the strange deity with incomprehension. The power of this being was unimaginable. Hades had attempted to stop him once, but the sword light had almost instantly erased his arm, then continued to tear through the ground. You cannot destroy the underworld, just as you cannot kill me. Your actions will enrage the entire world, just like Typhon, the king of all monsters who once sought to destroy the world. You. No, we are not the same. Interrupting, Lane lifted his head to look at Hades in front of him. The previously elusive train of thought suddenly connected. He needed a method, a way to directly harm the origin of the world, something that mere destruction of physical structure could not achieve. And now, looking at the armless Hades, Lane suddenly understood. Deities are the delegates of laws. The origin of a deity is the most direct path to the origin. As for the essence of immortality, this illusory world has none, and neither do the gods of Egypt, above and below Hemenu. Chapter 461. Death in the Netherworld under the blazing sun. We are not the same. Standing in the sky of the underworld, not a single drop of blood flowed from Hades' severed arm. It was as if that limb had never existed. Some terrible power prevented the regeneration of Hades' divine body, delaying his recovery to his original form. But in that moment, Hades disregarded his own physical incompleteness and the pain feedback from his godhood, and looked directly into the eyes of the outsider, despite the mountainous and oceanic pressure. Devoid of any emotion, in the outsider's gaze, Hades saw not a hint of regard for life. It was as if he wasn't seeing another deity, but an object, a lifeless thing. Even inferior to how a deity might view a mortal, Hades didn't know that, even if his own divinity hadn't reached the point of cold indifference to all beings, Lane couldn't possibly harbor any emotion for an entity in a false world. He simply took it as a sign of the outsider's resolute intent. So, in that moment, Hades cast aside all his past understanding. He didn't know why the outsider really dared to act against the underworld, nor did he understand what he meant by different, but perhaps, as Lane said, this powerful deity that suddenly appeared truly possessed some unknown method. His perception was frantically warning him, an alert coming from the underworld itself, although by common sense, no amount of power should be able to damage the core of the underworld. Hades trusted the intuition of inherent deities more. If it were the past, like at the dawn of the age when competing for the position of divine king, Hades might have chosen to withdraw, to retreat from the earth into the depths of the darkness. But now the underworld was right behind him, and he had nowhere left to retreat. At that instant, Hades actually felt a twinge of regret. Unlike his current self, the original trajectory of the underworld had neither wraiths, and Zeus's journey was much smoother. These thoughts inevitably led Hades to reminisce about that day. Maybe he shouldn't have given up back then. Even if he had failed, it would have been better than now, having waited half an era without seeing any possibility for progress. But reality has no ifs. What's missed is missed. What seemed like a long time was but a moment, and Hades, with no retreat, involuntarily took a step forward facing Lane. Come! The ground trembled slightly as if signifying the end of days, and the underworld seemed to sense the will of Hades, unleashing an unprecedented power. The heavens were filled with surging gray light like a rising tide, inch by inch ascending into the sky. This was the pinnacle of Hades' power, an innate backlash of the underworld when wounded, a power of preordained divinity that continued to rise amid passionate emotion. It was enough to cause any true god in the world to retreat, but unfortunately, these struggles were futile before the enemy they faced. With a downward press of his left hand in the void, what had risen in that instant was instantly suppressed, the underworld trembling as a result. The right hand threw the black sword, the gathered power of death, dissipating into mist, moving through the air before recongealing into solid form, transforming into a long chain. Under Lane's will, it traversed the void, binding Hades' body tightly. In the original myth, Thanatos, the god of death, possessed such a chain, forged by the godsmith Hephaestus as a divine artifact. This feeble death god used it to hook the souls of mortals. He is still busy in the mortal realm at present and has not returned to the underworld, nor had a chance to witness in a phantom world what true death looks like. But like many offspring of chaos, Thanatos' flawed wisdom could hardly compare to mortals. He once fell for a king's trick and was shackled by his own artifact, becoming the first deity to be imprisoned by humans. Of course, the fate of that king was clear. After all, mortals might defeat a deity temporarily, but if they lose once, the price is eternity. Now, however, the same authority, the same style of chains, and the creation of death had Hades firmly locked in midair. Clatter, clatter. His frantic struggle set off the sound of clashing chains, but Hades' resistance was obviously ineffective. At this moment, there was no third person in the sky. Those underworld deities who had ascended with Hades were long gone, not knowing where they had fled. And now, as spring still reigned in the mortal world, even Persephone was with her mother, completely unaware of the happenings here. Therefore, suspended in isolation in the sky, Lane's expression could not help but turn somber. Once again extending his hand into the void, this time, Lane drew a stone sword. As he grasped the hilt, it seemed to trigger a certain rule, and flames of gold erupted abruptly around him, failing to harm him in the slightest, but rather adding a golden cloak rustling in the underworld sky. This was the great solar incineration, a curse capable of scorching even common true gods, a remnant of the ancient sun god, split from consciousness and left behind in the world. It would burn any being that tried to wield it, making it unbearable for the weak and unnecessary for the strong. But at this moment, what Lane required was not its strength but the nature of its authority. If a system could not be destroyed from the outside, it should be dismantled from within. The best way to accomplish this was to insert into the intricate system something that was incompatible and indestructible. Chapter 462. Death in the Netherworld under the blazing sun _2. Zing! The stone sword pierced through the air, penetrating Hades' chest, but it seemed as if the two were not on the same spatio-temporal plane. There was no sound of a blade cutting flesh. Behind the Lord of the Underworld, there was no sign of a sword point emerging. At this moment, only Lane knew that the sword had actually used Hades' godhood as a medium, following some connection deep into the origin sea, stabbing into the core symbolizing the underworld. In the illusory world devoid of physical law's protection, the sun penetrated the underworld so easily. For a moment, the entire world seemed to pause, and then came the endless light and heat radiating from the sky of the underworld. The dull sky was replaced by light, a great sun's phantom high in the sky, scorching the dark gray land. Wisps of mist rose, then vanished into nothingness in midair. Watching all this, Lane finally nodded, clearly seeing that his attack had truly taken effect. Hades was not a primordial god, and the land of the underworld was but a manifestation of the material world. If previously, the power of death had only damaged the surface of the underworld, now the stone sword had reached straight to the root. In just a few moments, tiny cracks had started appearing at the core of the underworld, and on Hades' body, wisps of vapor were being evaporated away. Attacking the exterior, only a little would reflect on the origin. But harming the origin would certainly be reflected in the symbolic outer world. Just like now, Hades suddenly found a wave of warmth rising from his mind, then spreading ceaselessly throughout his body. Whoosh! What have you done? The sound of clashing chains rang out again. Hades was struggling desperately. In this moment, his power began to disperse, to retreat, like a tough wire inserted into the gears of a precise machine, slowing down its operation, even causing its parts to conflict with each other. The entire cycle of the underworld was affected, showing a trend towards collapse. As the ruler of the underworld, Hades could clearly sense this. But bound in mid-air, he was powerless to act. Of course, as the foreign object embedded in the underworld, the stone sword carrying the sun was under even more terrible pressure, but this was meaningless. Because throughout the process, whether it was the sun or the various authorities that constituted the underworld, they themselves were unharmed. It was only as a whole they were forced to separate. To the sun, whether it split or not, it remained the sun, but for the authorities that made up the underworld, together, they formed the self-sustaining underworld. Apart, they were but individual forces with different powers. Even an authority like the underworld, which had a clear regional nature, was far from the likes of destiny and lies. As the structure of the underworld was slowly dismantled day by day, its status diminished. Good. This is what I wanted. Ignoring the false deity's questioning, Lane maintained his hand in a grasping motion. He was wrestling with the illusory underworld, preventing the stone sword carrying the sun from being reflexively expelled from the origin by the cycle of the realm. Although destruction is easier than creation, the structure and cycle of the world have inertia. Even if this is just an illusory world, it couldn't completely disintegrate in a brief moment. 7 days. Making a silent judgment, Lane stood calmly in the sky of the underworld, like dragging the nether beneath the earth, letting the sun shine directly upon the land of the dead. In 7 days, this place would completely disintegrate, and as the original ruler of the underworld, Hades would turn to dust under the sunlight. Reality, the divine palace of the underworld. The grand, lavish hall held Hades resting his elbow on the armrest, leaning on his throne for a moment. The newly appointed queen of the underworld stood not far away. In front of her was a cradle, inside which lay a baby with facial scars. Persephone gently rocked the cradle, singing an unknown tune. Waves of invisible power flowed with her voice, entering the withered body of the child. He was being transformed, from earthly to chthonic, from alive to dead, of course, and from dead to alive. He was favored by the powers of the underworld, nurtured personally by the queen of the underworld, so in some sense, this baby could also be considered the child of Hades and Persephone. Of course, since he was not born from her directly, he would naturally not become a true god. But a creature born through such a process, aside from immortality and authority, would probably not differ too much in mere strength. Time passed by the second, and at some point the queen of the underworld also sat back in her place. The transformation of that baby was not an overnight matter. After all, he had once been blessed by the guardianship power of Hestia. Moreover, Persephone's control over the authorities of the underworld was not yet so effortless. Such delicate operations were taxing for her as well. Resting with closed eyes, Persephone was in good spirits. Life in the underworld was indeed very nice. If it could be a bit brighter, that would be all the better. Stop it! Hey! Suddenly, an angry shout shattered the calm of the divine palace, and the vast ashen grounds trembled for a moment. However, perhaps realizing something, as the voice's owner reigned in their power, everything returned to normal. Inside the divine palace of Hades, Hades abruptly awoke from his sleep. He gasped for air, his sharp gaze sweeping around. But all that met his eyes were the temple's pillars and the slender figure of the queen of the underworld. "What's wrong with you? Did you have a nightmare? Didn't expect you to be frightened by a nightmare?" Initially startled, she then spoke teasingly. But in Persephone's eyes, one could see a flicker of clear concern and vigilance. Gods seldom dream, especially not unpleasant dreams. After all, there has been no talk of a deity governing dreams in the world of today, so excluding the interference of external forces, the nightmare itself could very likely be an ominous portent from fate. "Huh! It's nothing, probably just a warning." His heartbeat slowly relaxed, and Hades gradually returned to his usual demeanor. He waved his hand, signaling that there was no need for concern, but clearly, the queen of the underworld's curiosity had been piqued. "What did you dream about? Were you thrown into the abyss? Or was someone trying to strip you of your throne as the king of the underworld?" She made two guesses which she thought were the most likely scenarios. As for anything else, it likely wouldn't be enough to elicit such a violent reaction from Hades. "No." Shaking his head, the king of the underworld denied it. "Then what was it?" Growing more curious, Persephone couldn't help but press further. Before her, after hesitating for a moment, Hades still revealed the truth. "It was actually a ludicrous vision. I dreamed that the underworld was destroyed by someone." Seeing the queen's skeptical look, Hades gestured for her to hold her comments. He stood up from the throne, his gaze sweeping across the plains outside. The number of high-ranking wraiths was growing, and the underworld was expanding, everything progressing towards a better future. "This is the best choice." Muttering quietly to himself, Hades smiled, then spoke to Persephone. "The memories of the dream are vague. I am not clear on the cause and effect. I hardly remember the specifics, but in general, it seemed like an unfavorable ending. There were no wraiths, no strength, and I sat alone on the throne until one day, a being emanating light came down to the underworld. He stood before me, proclaiming he was going to destroy the entire world. And then what? Then he did it." Sitting back down in his chair, the king of the underworld gripped the armrest. He looked upward slightly, as though gazing at the nether moon, or perhaps at the mortal realm above the ground. He drew the sun down to the underworld, or perhaps dragged the underworld up to the mortal realm. Light and heat enveloped the world, and under the blazing sun, I was scorched for 7 days, without a drop of dew, without a breeze, in a place unknown to all. I and the underworld turned to ashes. This was the end of the dream. It's interesting, isn't it? What's interesting about that? A bit confused, Persephone asked. Well, what I mean is, what then after he destroyed the underworld? He laughed softly and then shook his head. Never mind. It has nothing to do with me. It's just a preposterous dream after all. The laws of this world are so mighty. A dream is ultimately just a dream. Compared to it, this underworld of mine is the truly real world. Chapter 463, Eternal Ownership and the Book of Ages. Fantasy World, Olympus. The sun rose in the east and set in the west, illuminating the mountains across the earth as if unaware of another fierce sun rising underground. Zeus and the other gods still lingered at the peak, enjoying the muses singing and dancing while waiting for that ignorant newcomer god. Deities care little about such brief moments in time, but not all were interested. Athena, for example, found an excuse to leave early and return to her palace atop the Mount of the Gods. Athena still had many doubts about this seemingly real yet fantastical world. She wasn't disinterested in learning more about those unfamiliar deities, but reality did not allow her to linger there, because the goddess of wisdom, merged with another self, did not inherit the memories of the original body. Every word she said might reveal her abnormality, or perhaps go unnoticed. However, given the uncertainty of how long this sudden change would last, she naturally opted for the most cautious approach. Walking on the steps paved with white jade, Athena quietly admired the new sights of Olympus. Perhaps because time had moved on, or maybe because Hephaestus's skills truly surpassed those of the Cyclops. Either way, The divine palaces rising along the seemingly endless ridges of the Mount of the Gods appeared even more majestic. They even boasted styles that were more distinctive, not typical of gods but as if the deities had been influenced by mortals. For those who lived there all along, they felt nothing unusual, but Athena perceived it very clearly. Gods and humans influence each other, even if they themselves are unaware. Pondering silently, the goddess continued forward. Her destination was her archive. The layout of her own palace was unknown to her, but Athena believed she would have such a place. And as expected, guided by the sense of divine power, she found her palace easily. Led by a somewhat puzzled maid, she quickly found the personal study amidst a complex network of corridors. Step, 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 creak. Is this the place? A sky-blue dress hid the maiden goddess's figure, with a light purple sash casually tied around her slender waist. Athena pushed open the door and began to survey the room's interior. A circular, vast archive, large rings surrounding smaller ones with shelves crammed with books on every level. It was Athena's first time seeing so many artifacts filled with knowledge, and a smile unwittingly graced her lips. Whether this world was real or illusory, one thing's value remained unchanged: knowledge. And this place was likely where the most knowledge in the world could be found. Even the collection of the Divine King could hardly compare to it, if Zeus were really interested in it. Yes, Your Highness, this is your study. Bowing respectfully, the nymph standing beside replied softly. She was somewhat puzzled. After all, this was the goddess's own palace's archive. But divine matters hardly allow for doubt. Regardless of why she was asked to lead the way, she raised no objections. Among the Olympian gods, Athena was indeed one of the more pleasant ones, but in any case the other was a deity. Very well. Nodding her head, Athena returned to the present. She glanced slightly at the maid, who looked at the ground, then her finger moved slightly. With a thump, the nymph collapsed to the floor. In the next moment, an invisible force lifted her and placed her on a small bed inside the archive that the goddess had prepared. She would likely sleep for quite a long duration, until Athena fully grasped the situation. With her own ignorance about the situation, the goddess did not wish to create any more accidents. Now, let's see how the history of this world differs from what I know. Exhaling a breath, Athena stepped forward. Her skirt trailed over the floor that could mirror one's image, and she started to scrutinize the categorically sorted books. Some of them dealt with skills, some were biographies glorifying deities, and others were histories of kingdoms. However, after looking around, Athena couldn't find any documents that chronicled the entire world's history. She was initially surprised, then had a moment of realization. She nearly forgot one thing: books are written by beings with wisdom. Humans need to record history to pass it on to future generations, but deities are immortal beings. They don't need to record their past in books since their own memories serve as the book of ages. Thus, deities don't record the entire history, and mortals lack the divine power and lifespan to write histories spanning across the ages. So, do I need to summarize it myself? Frowning briefly but then relaxing, Athena looked at the books recounting gods and humans. Their authors were either followers of the gods or scholars from human kingdoms, and the content inevitably contained some subjective judgment. But if she read enough, comprehended enough, Athena could piece together the true complete picture of history like assembling a puzzle, and comprehend the events that had occurred in this world's past. It promised to be no small task, but a monumental and complex endeavor. After all, to identify the single truth among various contradictory statements required not only wisdom but also ample time and experience. Chapter 464. Eternal Ownership and the Book of Ages _2. Fortunately, Athena was not without aid. She had other means to accelerate the process. Thus the goddess in the form of a young girl took a scroll of ancient appearance from her waist, the divine artifact that was supposed to take her through her memories, yet now had brought her to another world. This was the only thing the goddess had brought with her. Aside from this, whether it was the clothes on her body or the spear of victory and shield of Aegis, those were what another herself naturally possessed. Through centuries of continuous use, Athena had gradually come to understand the might of this scroll. It could do more than read memories. In fact, the function relating to memories was but a trivial accessory. Its true ability lay in the manipulation of existence, the utilization of constants, and it was also the gateway to history. Memory is a summary and trace of the past, a life's cognition of bygone days. Thus, the exploration of memory was included in the functions of this divine artifact. Now, with its power, Athena could easily collect all the literature in the archive and from there, reconstruct the most authentic scene of history. This was going to be much simpler. A divine artifact related to history could naturally and easily discern the true from the false. Standing inside the palace, the goddess slowly untied the strap of the scroll. As the strap fell to the ground, the divine artifact began to emit a faint light. But Athena did not rush to use it. She only stared at this naturally formed creation for a good while and then, at a certain moment, spoke softly. "It's been a long time since our last meeting. I didn't expect to see you again here. It's a bit rude of me, but last time I didn't get the chance to ask, how should I address you?" The world's transition originated from the reading of memories, and all of it was manipulated by this divine artifact. If this could still be considered accidental, then the apparition seen earlier certainly confirmed that everything was inevitable and related to that mysterious existence. Compared to understanding the history of this world, Athena actually wanted to know more about how to leave this place. And the most crucial of all was naturally to communicate with the person who had caused all this. Moreover, the other party had indeed given a sign. With this thought, Athena's expression grew even more resolute. As her words fell, there was no reaction at first. But after a short while, the scroll, symbolically held in the goddess's hands, began to tremble softly. Athena let go of the scroll, and then before her, it slowly opened. On its originally blank title page, a streak of ink manifested. "This is unexpected. I had not thought your memory would turn out like this before today. However, I will put an end to all this. As for my name," there was a pause, as if the existence behind it was pondering how to refer to itself. After a moment, the ink continued, and a line of small print appeared above it. "Compared to many creatures in this world, I was indeed born different. So if you need a name to call me by, then call me Yahweh." The writing appeared and then vanished, as if nothing had ever happened. But when the author of the ink acknowledged this name, it was not just the goddess who remembered it, but the world itself had it etched into its heart. The name of the Lord of the Spirit Realm itself possessed some unfathomable quality. Yet the effect of this appellation was diminished. This was true for both the gods and the world. Note, Yahweh is the romanization of the Hebrew pronunciation. Inside the archive, everything was as usual. The candlelight flickered slightly, casting its glow upon Athena's fair cheeks. The uncertain light seemed to reflect her thoughts, which were equally elusive. Yahweh. Athena silently mouthed the title, momentarily at a loss for words. Using a name that sounded like an adjective was not a unique practice, quite the contrary, it was very much in line with the features of the current era. Just like one of Athena's other names, Tritogenia, which meant the third child born, following Apollo and Artemis. Of course, in this altered world, the birth order had changed, so only in this illusory world had Athena ever heard someone addressing her in this way. In addition, another name often used by Zeus to disguise himself before mortal princesses or queens, Clonides, was a direct expression of son of Cronus. So it must be said that it was quite remarkable how the divine king was able to use such a pseudonym without ever being found out, whether it was because Zeus himself had cast some influence, or the queens and princesses of the chaos world weren't that perceptive. Either way, it was a reasonable method of naming that was widely propagated among the gods. However, that being said, not every word that served as an adjective could be used carelessly. The names of gods were bestowed by the world, and they often possessed special powers and a strong connection with other deities. If a self-assigned epithet were to create a connection as deep, it had to be equally true. In such cases, even the goddess of beauty couldn't call herself the most beautiful in the world. because this concept was tied to her godhood and the name Aphrodite. Without her divine role, whether she was truly the most beautiful would be debatable. Besides being true, these epithets also contained a hint of the distinguished status of their bearers. Whether Zeus or Athena liked it or not, a major source of their identity, apart from the authority bestowed by the world, came from their royal lineage. From this perspective, if this mysterious being claimed such a title, it meant he truly was self-existent and everlasting. The world granted the gods authority and power, yet he was inherently endowed with these. The world could revoke a deity's power, but his eternity remained intact. Athena didn't know if the primordial gods were like this, but even if they were, certainly not every one of them would possess such ability, as the example of Gaia had shown. And from the latter perspective, such a transcendent entity naturally didn't need anyone else to affirm his nobility, for he himself was the origin of everything. "My apologies, sir." With a faint smile, Athena offered a slight bow without a sound. Her heart was somewhat shaken, but she was more cautious than anything. No one extends goodwill to a stranger for no reason. If they did, there must be some purpose. "Don't worry about it. What comes naturally doesn't prove anything. Let's talk about you instead." The ink marks emerged and disappeared, noticeably faster than before. Athena felt a stir in her heart. Perhaps the person behind the script was not idle, engrossed in some task, and now finally had a moment to spare. This is a false world, yet it contains a true destiny relative to itself. Now, all of that has been swept into a pile of old papers, never to be realized again. So, about leaving this place, is there anything in particular you would like me to do? Still smiling lightly, the bright-eyed goddess inquired casually. "Leaving here isn't hard. What's important is what lies here. I've been contemplating this matter too, and your current actions have given me an idea. This world is false, but its original trajectory was true, indicating that its existence is a piece of history that should have been realized, acknowledged by chaos itself, just like the path it has taken up until now is the destined fate acknowledged by chaos." The writing paused again, then continued to appear. This time, however, the strokes of the ink seemed to carry a certain inexplicable significance. "I will destroy this world, Athena, and soon, the mount of the gods will crumble. The world will return to nothingness. And what you need to do is use this divine artifact as a medium, using this segment of non-existent history to bring about the birth of the annals of time." Chapter 465. Black Rain. At Mount Olympus within Athena's circular archive. The previous brief exchange had already concluded, and the palace once again fell into silence, with only the occasional sound of wax droplets falling. Ancient books floated in midair, enveloped by halos barely visible to the naked eye above the shelves, as information exchanged, as if something was being drawn out and pieced together. Once the will of its true master had departed, the divine artifact returned to Athena's control. At this moment, under her manipulation, the content recorded in the archives was extracted, and under the power of authority, filtered and assembled. No matter what she intended to do later, it did not affect Athena's eagerness to first understand the past of this world. Moreover, after the previous conversation, the goddess's appreciation for these documents increased by more than one level. After understanding what she was about to do, Athena finally became aware of her current environment. This was a false world, but it carried a complete and world-recognized destiny that became real because her memory of the Divine King's secret involved some terrifying power. Thus, everything here could be trusted, yet not fully trusted. Of course, in this matter, Athena believed she still had the capacity to judge, and this was also one of the benefits she could gain from this illusory journey. The information she acquired here was a rehearsal for the future, allowing Athena to make more correct choices in the future or avoid many troubles that could be evaded. Like Hermes, Hebe, the Golden Apple, and Hephaestus. How annoying! With a bit of examining, as the divine artifact organized, the past of this world gradually unveiled itself to Athena. Naturally, her primary focus was on matters related to deities. After all, in the Third Era, even though suppression had descended upon the present world, until now, it was ultimately the gods who decided the course of this world. Therefore, Athena would certainly pay extra attention to this, especially those gods not heard of in reality. First was that young deity she had previously encountered, then the daughter of Hera not yet born in reality, the goddess of youth Hebe, and Hera's only son, the smithing god Hephaestus. Initially, Athena's mood was quite good, but what surprised her was that as she read on, she actually found records of herself. Although the documents were vague, merely writing after the smithing god was betrayed by his wife. He sought love from the goddess of wisdom who came to have weapons forged, but failed, and his essence fell upon the earth, birthing Erichthonius. Just thinking about it, Athena knew the process could not be simple. Publicly spilling his essence upon the earth. Associated with another record in the documents, about the smithing god trapping his adulterous wife and her lover under a golden net and then summoning the other gods to watch. He must have been born in reality by now. Better keep my distance from him in the future. Quietly making up her mind, Athena felt it would be better to stay far away from this god with the peculiar hobbies. Should he insist on approaching, her divine artifact was no joke either. However, this increased the historical content's value in her eyes once more. Like the smithing god's behavior, while not greatly harmful, carried extreme indignity. Athena felt that if such a scene were also played out in reality, she could be disgusted by it for at least 1,000 years. The gold and crimson robe of dawn gradually faded, as the relentless sun hung high in the sky. While Athena was quietly perusing her archive, at the summit of Mount Olympus, the feast of the gods had just begun. Perhaps feeling that he had just threatened the gods and would soon display his force again, the divine king now appeared much more amiable. The muses, skilled in song, dance, and the arts, twirled gracefully in the hall, as the cupbearers of the gods poured out the fountain of youth into their golden goblets. At Hermes' invitation, Apollo even retrieved his lyre, playing an accompanying melody. For a moment, the atmosphere atop the mountain was very harmonious. Smiling, Zeus offered a drink to his queen of gods, only to be inevitably refused. The divine king was not surprised by this. After all, his previous command had indeed angered her. The cause of the current human wars was merely the extension of the discord between Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, an escalation of the old grievances among the gods. Thus, Zeus simply drank the nectar himself, then quietly observed the joyous gods. The atmosphere was so harmonious, filled with joy and beauty, that the gods had long forgotten that wars were still raging in the mortal realm, and mortals were shedding blood in rivers for their will. But this was to be expected. For the eternal deities, the outcomes in the mortal realm were both significant and insignificant. Power, face-saving, to the gods, they were merely tools to make their own lives more pleasurable. The divine king would not dwell on this, yet for some reason, he always felt a vague sense of unreality. Everything in his memory was correct, and what he saw before him was no different from ordinary days. However, feeling his power that could upheave the earth and shake the world, Zeus couldn't shake a sense of emptiness in his heart. When did this feeling start? Chapter 466. Black Rain _2. It seems it's today. What's today? Father God, please drink up this cup. A voice suddenly arose from beside him. Zeus turned around and saw it was Hermes, who had delivered the message earlier. The son he favored the most did not like to address him as Your Majesty, but the divine king felt quite good about it. If Zeus favored Apollo for being the most outstanding among his children, then his affection for Hermes was simply because he found the long-missed joy of being a father in him. Although the divine king himself was well aware that, as the cunning thief and the protector of merchants, no one knew which of Hermes's words were sincere, he didn't mind. Because Zeus was also very clear about why his other children were unwilling to be close to him. So, raising his cup once again, Zeus smiled and drained it in one gulp. Nothing, my child. I was just thinking of the message you brought not long ago. Since this era began, fewer and fewer true gods have been born into the world, and only among my offspring, as the divine king, are there exceptions. The birth of a new deity is also a rare event. It is indeed rare, but all this is your doing, Father God. Under your rule, the gods have been restrained. The immortals no longer ravage the earth as they did in the first two eras, and the cities of mortals have grown ever more prosperous. Placing his right hand over his heart, Hermes said with a smile, "Perhaps this is the world's praise for your achievements. A recognition of your accomplishments, perhaps." Ha 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 ha. You always have such a way with words. Zeus laughed heartily amidst his son's flattery. The slight sense of unreality he had felt before now cast aside by the divine king. Yes, just as Hermes had said, the world was no longer like the first two eras. The gods were submissive before the divine court, and he was the ruler of the sky and the earth, the king of all kings in the mortal realm. So tell me, why have you come? It can't be just to compliment me with a few words. The laughter stopped for a moment, and Zeus asked. He had already decided in his heart that as long as it was not too excessive a request, he would agree to Hermes's wish. However, contrary to expectation, the young deity did not seek any favor. Actually, it's still about your concerns, Father God. I had only conveyed half of the divine will to the mortal realm when an accident brought me back to the Mount of the Gods. Now, I must continue to fulfill my mission. Humans' perception of time differs from ours, Hermes said with a bow and a smile. If I delay a few more days, who knows what kind of accident might happen? Yes, you're right. After a moment's thought, Zeus had to admit that Hermes was correct. He waved his hand, signaling that the other could leave on his own accord. Then you should go, but it's a pity. If you're gone too long, you might miss the scene of the new god bowing in fealty to me. That won't happen, Father God. Your power is so immense, as noble as your character. I imagine that even far away in the mortal realm, I could witness your supreme majesty. May your reign be everlasting, King of the gods. Leaving behind his final words, Hermes's winged shoes fluttered slightly, and he turned into a streak of light, departing far from the Mount of the Gods. The gods only glanced at this before returning to their own concerns, for as the messenger of the divine king, he was always coming and going in a hurry. Thus Hermes departed on his way, but as he grew farther from the Mount of the Gods, a hint of relief suddenly flashed in the young deity's eyes. Who knows what will happen here in a few days? Better to hide out in the mortal realm for a while. After all, I'm not much of a warrior, and anyway, one more or one less of me won't make a difference. As the thought flitted through his mind, Hermes identified a direction and dashed towards it at breakneck speed. No one knew just how terrified Hermes had been when he summoned the new god's shadow and realized he could not control it. It was like a mortal witnessing the stuffed toy at the foot of their bed coming to life and smiling at them. In that instant, the young deity was drenched in cold sweat. Glancing back at Olympus, for some reason, the mighty Mount of the Gods seemed to have become a bit hazy. Shaking his head, Hermes stopped dwelling on it and once again hastened his pace. I'll stay away for 1 month. No, a full year. By then, whatever it is should have ended. He thought to himself as he gritted his teeth. Soon, all that was left was a fleeting streak of his light across the sky. As the final minor incident concluded, atop Mount Olympus, the gods remained oblivious to everything. The sun rose and set, and swiftly 7 days passed by. Nothing had changed, and no one cared about these brief days. Until today, while the gods were merrily feasting, a violent tremor suddenly emanated from deep beneath the earth. Mountains quivered, oceans churned, and goblets from the feast spilled onto the ground. The gods looked puzzledly toward the world beyond the mountain. Then their gazes converged on the divine king seated at the head. The violent noise seemed to come from the underworld, and Hades indeed had not come to Mount Olympus. This stirred their curiosity, as no one knew what the typically obedient and weak Hades was up to. Yet when they looked up, the gods saw even Zeus with a look of astonishment on his face. "Your Majesty, what has happened?" asked one deity, and Zeus, after observing for a moment, spoke with some uncertainty. "That is the law of the underworld. invading the surface. What? Someone exclaimed in alarm, only to be met with skepticism from others. Your Majesty, that seems improbable. Even if Hades is the lord of the underworld, he can't possibly do that. Indeed, just as Zeus could not let the laws of the living realm invade the abyss, theoretically Hades could not do something akin to self-destruction. However, the divine king, after observing again for a moment, nodded affirmatively. I'm not entirely sure myself, but it is so. The origins of the underworld seem to be rebelling, flowing in every direction. If this continues, Zeus had been explaining, but in the next instant he stopped speaking, because he no longer needed to say more. In silence, the sky darkened. Black rain drifted down, from east to west, from south to north, over oceans and continents, and even between the stars. Endless waters flowed from high places, signifying the collision of laws. The rain carried the power of the underworld, altering the environment of the living world, or rather, when the essence of death infused the realm of the living, such changes were inevitable. The gods did not know that this signified the collapse of the underworld. As its structure crumbled, the laws that formed it did not vanish. They simply attempted to merge into the nearby mortal realm, and the black rain was an external manifestation of this. But what truly silenced Zeus was not this, but the news that came with the black rain from the primal sea. Hades had died, along with his final warning. It seems like, after listening for a while, Zeus, who had stood up from his throne unintentionally, finally heard that voice. Despair, silence, release, and the final admonition from his own brother. It's the outsider, destruction. He has already arrived. Chapter 467, Having and Not Having. What has happened? Hermes, go to the underworld and see for yourself. Tell me what's going on there. Outside the Mount of the Gods, moments before it had been bright, but now it was enveloped in dullness. The color tone of the entire world darkened for a time, and standing before the throne, Zeus's divine power dispelled the chill in the air, but failed to dispel the unease at the bottom of his heart. Hades was dead, and even now the divine king found it hard to believe, even preferring the idea of some kind of misjudgment. After all, since the beginning of creation, he had never heard of a deity dying. So Zeus called upon his messenger. He wanted him to personally go to the underworld and see for himself. After all, when it came to speed, Hermes might not be the fastest of the gods, but he was still the principal god worshipped by travelers. His unique authority allowed him to traverse easily between the two realms, swiftly moving between the earth and the underworld. That's also why the divine king had chosen him as his messenger. However, after a long while, there was no response to Zeus's call within the temple. So the divine king looked around and finally set his gaze on Helios. Your Majesty, Hermes has not returned since he left 7 days ago. Helios responded upon seeing Zeus's gaze turn to him. Yes, that's right, he went at my command. After a moment of silence, Zeus remembered this matter. He had thought that Hermes had already returned, but clearly he had not. Although several days had passed, Hermes was still in the mortal realm. Perhaps after completing the task he was given, he went off to other places to wander, which was a common occurrence for him. It wouldn't have been a serious issue, but now, obviously, Zeus could no longer afford to wait for him. Sigh. Exhaling, the uncertainty in the divine king's heart dispersed. He admitted that he had been a little afraid just now, even though he did not yet know what his enemy was. While God's not dying was an iron rule since the dawn of creation, the movements from the sea of origin had never been false. If two absolutes were in conflict, clearly one had been violated, and that was exactly what he was worried about. So Zeus's first instinct was to have someone probe the situation, which had always been his habit. But after calming down, he abandoned that idea. If Hades's death turned out to be false, then there was nothing to fear. But if it was true, then, my fellow deities, let's all go and see for ourselves now, the divine king said indifferently. The next moment, with a violent roaring sound, A golden light flew from a palace on Mount Olympus directly into Zeus's hand. It was his thunder. He had not used it for many years because, since Typhon, there had been few in the world worthy of his full effort. Holding the divine artifact that had accompanied him through many battles, Zeus's mood surprisingly calmed down. If Hades was truly dead, then whatever caused all this, as long as it had consciousness, it could not possibly coexist with the gods. Since confrontation was inevitable, what purpose was there in delaying? The 3 generations of divine kings from chaos might have had their differences, but at least in one aspect they were similar, at least from the beginning to the end. When there was no way to avoid it, they all dared to swing their swords at powerful enemies. So Zeus stepped out of the palace and stood at the summit of the Mount of the Gods. He looked down upon the earth. First were the layers of gray clouds, lining up in succession from bottom to top, as if separating the celestial realm from the mortal realm. Looking through these rain-drenched clouds, the rumbling of the earth continued. With a flick of his right hand, the silver serpent shimmering on the thunder plunged from the sky like a chain, sinking deeply into the earth's poles. Come then, let me see what you truly are. Directly entering the underworld that was naturally impossible. Courage was not recklessness, so holding the other end of the chain, Zeus pulled hard. At first, there was no change, and the earth's rumbling was masked by the original tremors. However, quickly, Olympus sank slightly and the vast layers of ground were lifted by the divine king, heading towards the sky. If he did not want to go underground, then he would just lift up the lid. That was Zeus's thinking. Thus, as the land rose under his immense strength, all living beings wailed in despair. But no one could stop him. Even the gods behind Zeus were momentarily shocked by such a terrifying power and forgot the lives dwelling in the mortal realm. Until the next moment, a dazzling light suddenly emerged from underground, causing the earth to split left and right. The 7th day. In just a few days, within the dark and deep underworld, the landscape had completely changed. The shadow of the great sun hung high in the sky, even becoming more solid. Emitting increasingly strong light and heat, it seemed to purify the gray earth to reveal a dark hue. The underworld appeared to have lost some of its original properties. It was gradually becoming more like an ordinary earth. This seemed to be a good thing if one ignored its other change. Now, standing in the sky and looking down, the vast underworld had shrunk to less than 100 miles in size, and at the very edges, it was continuously crumbling and eroding. The once expansive space was now empty, with only the endless void sustaining the world's existence there. The void had no size, and in fact, relative to the material within the world, it could not even be said to exist. If the world beyond was non-existence, and within was existence, then the void that carried the world was non-existence within existence, existence within non-existence. Chapter 468. Presence and Absence _2. Here, there is no material, which is also what the world looked like at its inception. And now, standing in the void, about to destroy a world by his own hands, Lane had gained a deeper understanding of the creation of the universe. He did not know why the world was born, or how the first concept had emerged from absolute nothingness. Just as humans in later generations did not understand how the heavens and the universe had appeared at the beginning. They could only make every effort to guess the initial state of all things, but in the end, they could not explain how this beginning came to be. It was like the physical laws of the world, which are objectively existing things. If there had to be a reason, then it was everything was naturally so. Therefore, if one really had to name this original driving force, then Lane thought the way might be more suitable to describe it. And the first one that the way gave birth to was the void that carries the world. It was something with respect to absolute nothingness, but it was non-existent to all things within the world. It was on its foundation that one gave birth to two, and together matter and spirituality were born, in both opposition and unity, and from their intersection, all things began. Now, the collapse of the world was also following such a process. As the scope of the underworld became smaller and more matter disintegrated, Lane could feel that its part of spirituality was also dissipating. When everything ended, this place would return to the environment it was in at the beginning of creation, empty except for the void. In that case, I came to this world at the latest time, probably even before the two were born. Making a silent judgment, although Lane did not know what use it was, it did not prevent him from keeping it in mind. He had always been attentive to the years when he had been without consciousness at first. Crack. With a change in expression, Lane slightly lifted his head. Following the sound, it turned out that just a short distance below him, a tiny crack had appeared on the black chains that locked an invisible mass. The divine body of Hades had long since crumbled, completely incinerated and destroyed under the blaze of the sun. But the chains of death could lock not just tangible existence, so Hades still had no chance of escaping. As for the chains that were now breaking apart, it was not because they could not hold him anymore. On the contrary, this signified his end. The black chains of death would only bind the living. When Hades irrevocably entered his end, the chains that had lost their purpose naturally also lost their value to exist. When the chains completely disintegrated, it would be the moment Hades died. However, at that moment, Lane unexpectedly discovered that the consciousness of Hades appeared to still be very lucid. Although he could no longer make out a form, he could be sure that the other was looking at him, even speaking something to him. The task at hand was completed, and the arrangements with Athena were all made. So when this place ended, Lane planned to cleanly finish this world. Therefore, after realizing this, he didn't mind listening to what the other was thinking. Compared to the underworld, completely destroying this world would take even less time. As he had said before, the reason he waited these 7 days was basically to verify the process of world disintegration. Otherwise, without the world's restrictions on his power taking effect, Lane could very easily end it all. After all, the gap between these gods in the fantasy world and their real selves was as vast as the difference between a strand of power that composed this world and the complete chaos, their strength largely only existing in settings. The tricks Lane prepared were to deal with Heminu, and were simply unnecessary for this world alone. Outsider. At the convergence of the black chains, a certain concept subtly stirred. It could not emit sound, but when Lane wanted to listen, he could still hear it. So he nodded his head, acknowledging this title. Yes, perhaps as a form of self-rescue, in these 7 days, Hades will had an unprecedented close bond with the gradually disintegrating underworld, and it was for this reason that he saw many things that he should not have seen. The outsider he spoke of was one of them. Although Hades still could not realize his own false essence, he had still discerned that Lane did not belong to this world. You are going to destroy the entire world. Yes. Lane nodded again, his expression unchanged. A longer silence followed, and with it came the sounds of chains snapping one after another. The underworld below had shrunk to less than a square mile, which was practically non-existent for an entire realm. Just when Lane thought Hades was about to meet his end, he heard a third inquiry. Why, do you wish to destroy us? Turning his head, Lane looked at the concept that was about to completely dissipate. He had considered whether to say something, but ultimately decided against it. This was merely a fantasy world, so in the end, he simply stated indifferently, if there must be a reason, I suppose that's the reason. He has arrived. Boom. The last bits of residue vanished completely, and the tremors of the illusory primordial sea coupled with the final warning of Hades echoed between the worlds. But Lane paid no heed to these. The dissolution of the underworld confirmed his theory, although there were some unsatisfactory aspects. For example, in his perception, the destruction of the underworld didn't cause much impact on this world. For the ecosystems of the mortal realm, it might have been near total annihilation, but the world itself only momentarily weakened. Lane could even see that, without further interference, the origin forces that invaded the human world could be expelled through the world cycles over long eras, and then they would reassemble and form a new underworld in this void. Even though it was bound to be a lengthy era, it was something that would inevitably happen. The power of the underworld is, after all, part of this world. It would be damaged due to the collapse of certain structures, but as long as these materials persist, everything can be repaired. But this is already enough. After all, for that world, Chaos is the enemy that even now, it is still fighting against. When external pressures are immense, even the smallest of internal injuries can be amplified a millionfold. With a flick of his sleeve, he gathered all that remained here. After completing the final cleanup, Lane slightly raised his head. Standing in the void, above the top of the concept, he could see the ground rising slowly. Someone was pulling it up, and that was the power of thunder. Lane identified it with ease. Perhaps it was a display of power, or maybe using the earth as a shield, or more likely not wanting to venture into the unknown peril. In any case, under Zeus's force, the ground truly was rising slowly. But now he had no intention of wasting any more time. So without waiting, Lane extended his finger and drew lightly in the air. Great sounds signify silence. Great images are formless. It was a noise that should have shaken heaven and earth. Yet at this moment, it seemed so inconsequential. The next instant, the earth above the void of the underworld split in two, revealing the sky and the sun, as well as the divine king standing on Mount Olympus. "Is it you?" When Lane saw Zeus, the latter also saw him. And instantly, the divine king recognized him as the owner of the phantom from a few days ago. "You are that outsider. What have you done to the underworld?" A questioning roar boomed like thunder, yet Lane didn't respond. He looked towards Zeus, and he also gazed upon the primordial seas connected by the divine authority. They appeared so mighty yet so hollow. "It's over." His figure vanished on the spot like a bubble, and in the next moment, an indescribable colossal shadow loomed over the world. It reached out, grasping both the earth and the sky. A gentle squeeze, as though breaking an eggshell. As for Zeus's questioning, he didn't need to explain. After all, what did the destruction of this world have to do with them? Chapter 469. The Collapse. In the boundless void, a gigantic hand reached down from beyond the heavens, turning everything into dust. That's how it should have been, but in reality it clearly wouldn't be so direct. Because at the moment the fantasy world was on the brink of complete destruction, the force that had been maintaining the world's existence had no choice but to be withdrawn. It transformed into an impenetrable barrier, designed to combat the great enemy of this fractured world. Of course, a force can't be used in two places at once, so when the membrane made of creation energy collided with the gigantic hand, while it stopped itself from being instantly annihilated, the unsupported illusionary world inevitably moved toward its end. The powers of the gods were dissipating. The law that constituted all things was disintegrating. The only difference was one was a bit faster, the other a bit slower. After all, the collapse of self, however minuscule, still required a process. Ugh! Above the western seas, on a fragmented islet, Hermes awakened amidst excruciating pain. He opened his eyes and recalled the recent events. The instant that inexplicable hand from beyond seized hold, the true great divine power and the remnants of creation collided. In that moment, a terribly frightening surge swept across the world. All beings with intermediate divine power and below vanished in the blink of an eye, and mortals turned to dust. Although Hermes was not among them, he too suffered unimaginable damage. He briefly lost consciousness, and only after a while did he finally awake. Struggling to stand up from the ruins, Hermes couldn't help but gasp in pain. Hiss! I thought I had run far enough. Now it seems not nearly far enough. Every part of his body ached as if he had endured some cruel torture. Hermes, having never experienced such pain, grimaced. It was truly unbearable for a god. But that wasn't the most critical issue. As he regained his senses a bit, he truly realized the current situation. Hermes could distinctly feel that as the unseen titanic hand from beyond continued to retract its strength, a sense of emptiness and withdrawal from the origin rose in his heart. Others may not know what this was, perhaps thinking it was the world extracting the deity's powers to fight the external threat. But at this moment, Hermes perceived a deeper secret. Is this world fake? Heh! This is truly beyond my expectations. Finding amusement amidst suffering, Hermes chuckled. It must be said that, among the native gods of this false world, he was one of the only 3 deities who had perceived this distinction between truth and illusion. The first was Hades, who sensed it due to his deep connection with the origin of the underworld before death. The second was Zeus, who could feel everything simply because of his position as divine king. And Hermes was the third. The reason he could perceive it was entirely accidental. He was originally the child of the sky-bearing titan Atlas, and the son of the storm goddess Maia and Zeus. In the intended trajectory, he possessed exceptional wisdom even as an infant, with many attributes known innately to titan deities, eventually ascending to the position of one of Olympus's 12 principal gods. But, unfortunately, reality differed from this fantasy world, and a turning point occurred in Atlas's fate. The birth of Hermes was consequently influenced, and amid the impending destruction of the world, this consequence allowed him to have a subtle intuition of reality. More coincidentally, the roles of commerce within Hermes's godhood were later additions. What truly belonged to him by nature had some relation to theft and travel. Cough, cough, ruler of the thousand thunders, my revered father god, even now, you remain so mighty. After a light cough, Hermes looked in the direction where the land once lay. There, continents were divided, enormous spatial rifts devoured all like gaping maws. The only undamaged place was where Mount of the Gods, Olympus, was situated. That sky-bearing pillar, the home of the gods, an immense column of thunder that pierced through heaven and earth, shaking the heavens, was the embodiment of the divine king's unmatched power. But looking at this scene, Hermes felt a bit like laughing. Everything in the world suffers in comparison. Next to the colossal hand that enveloped the world, the thunder column, grandiose as it was, seemed less impactful. Instead, it was like an ant in the palm of the gigantic hand, provoking an existence it could never hope to oppose. Ha! Never mind that, it's better to leave now. What happens to my dear father god is his business. But if I wait any longer, I might not be able to leave at all. The greatest adventure of this world, a legendary journey, crossing between fantasy and reality. I just don't know what will be waiting for me on the other side. Are there any pretty girls? Despite his light-hearted words, gradually, the tension and fear in Hermes's heart were temporarily suppressed. He took one last look at this world, akin to the apocalypse, this world he had lived in for so long, which was in fact not real. Then, in the next moment, Hermes did not hesitate to muster his strength, igniting everything he possessed. Rather than waiting for the world to siphon them away to confront the destructor, he decided it would be better to make use of them. So in the next instant, from solid to ethereal, from stillness to extreme speed, Hermes's form swiftly turned into a dim streak of light, slicing through the sky in a flash. Chapter 470. The Collapse _2. In just a few flashes, unnoticed by any being, Hermes reached the end of the heavens, the place where the world collided with a giant hand. Terrifying fluctuations emanated from there, threatening to tear apart his consciousness. And at this crucial moment, Hermes forced himself to be spirited, expending his last bit of strength to use his authority. Thus, a crack opened before him, and through it came familiar yet strange energies. Hermes's plan had succeeded, but at the same time, an immense sense of fear arose in the heart of the young deity. Intuition told him that perhaps by passing through the crack, he really could reach where he wanted to go, but this very act was, in fact, not permitted by the world. The real-world Hermes had not yet been born, but would be born eventually. So, if he went there preempting the existence of the other, he would definitely have to pay a price. No one knew what that price would be. It could be the stripping of godhood, it could be a curse, or it could even be the loss of the immortal essence of a deity. After all, he was not an immortal to begin with, and things from a false world would not be effective in reality. So, if the present world was not willing to regrant Hermes with the essence of immortality, then it was very possible that he would no longer be eternal. Ha! As if I have a choice. Whether another me can be born in the real world in the future, what does it have to do with me? With a sneer, pausing only briefly, the stream of light surged forward once more. Not until he had completely entered the crack did Hermes finally breathe a sigh of relief. Regardless of what he had to pay, at least he had escaped. However, he also felt that his consciousness was blurring. The one who had burned everything was almost eternally asleep, and the godhood from the false world obviously couldn't provide him with real divine power. As for the laws of the present world, they didn't seem to be reacting too directly to him yet. It looks like I'm going to sleep for a very long time, until the world passes its sentence. Letting his consciousness drift, amidst his reflections, Hermes took one last glance at that fantasy world. Like a bubble about to burst, it was dazzling and shining, yet could only struggle helplessly before that inexplicable giant hand. What's that? Suddenly, something caught Hermes's attention. It was on the finger of the giant hand, where a ring, verdant and radiant, was worn. Tiny runes, like specks of dust, were etched onto it, as if interpreting some ultimate truths of the world. And watching this scene, although he didn't know what it was, Hermes deeply etched it into his heart. For something to be worn by such a terrifying being, it must also be one of the top treasures in the world. Moreover, in his current peculiar state, Hermes vaguely felt that it represented a kind of mystical knowledge highly compatible with him. When I wake up, if I can indeed wake up, I must study it. Quietly deciding, leaving a bit of hopeful expectation for the future, as Hermes's last bit of strength dissipated, like plunging into boundless darkness, his memory completely went silent. All returned to calm, and this escapee from the fantasy world thus entered a long slumber, waiting for the day of future awakening. Boom! Crack! Outside Mount Olympus, streaks of silver serpents fell from the mountain's peak, causing a great rumbling sound. The divine king's unmatched strength was unmistakable, a realm still beyond the reach of the other gods. Yet it was almost visible to the naked eye that the power contained within the thunder was no longer as strong as it had been at the outset. With the divine artifact scroll in hand, Athena in her white dress strolled midway up the Mount of the Gods. In a scene like the end of the world, the goddess seemed no different from usual. Her eyes were still bright, only now there was no audience. When the giant hand pressed down from the sky, Athena knew that the time had come. She gradually felt her connection with reality being restored, and at the same time, the power not her own within this body was also being withdrawn. However, she did not feel regretful. After all, false things might serve as reference, but should never be relied upon. Boom! Another bolt of lightning exploded midair, opening up dark spatial rifts. This was a sign of the instability of space and time. The fundamental rules of the world were losing their support. Everything was becoming fragile and brittle, and watching this scene, after weighing the situation, Athena finally placed her hand on the divine artifact. The reason Lane hadn't personally taken this step was not only because he was still wearing down the last resistance of this world, but the most important point was that he couldn't do it. To this fantasy world, he was but an outsider. To this memory, he was an observer, and even to the destined course of chaos, he was a disruptor. So he might be able to destroy this world, but he could never use it. Only Athena was different. The goddess of wisdom was an extremely important being in the destined light. It was still fundamentally manifested from her memories here. Everything in the fantasy world was naturally drawn to her, and most crucially, she bore a dead fate upon her. Yes, if Erebus could see it, Lane could see it as well. Pallas Athena, the child of Métis who surpassed her father, the arrogant king of gods and men, once had the chance to end Zeus's reign and become the fourth sovereign of the gods. But now, he no longer had the chance to be born.